Hey, true crime fanatics, this is Claire.
And I'm Andy.
You're tuned in to the Homicide Hobbies podcast, which is a podcast for people who love to hear about the horrendous crimes that people commit. Enjoy.
So today we're going to talk about Craig Chandler Price. Trigger warnings, we're going to talk about suicide, child crimes, stabbing, stalking, drug use, and prison violence.
Check all those boxes.
Yeah, just check on down the list. So we're going to start off on September 1st, 1989. 15-year-old Craig Price smoked some weed, and it was laced with LSD. And then he wandered down the street to the home of Joan Heaton. Now, Joan has, in her life, she's had a brief run-in with some tragedy. As an adult, Joan married Sergeant John Heaton. She was around 28 when they got married. And soon after they were married, they had their first daughter, Jennifer, in 1979. Then they had their second daughter, Melissa, in 1981, which I know this doesn't have anything to do with anything, but you've got Joan, John, Jennifer. It just drives me bonkers that they named their second daughter Melissa. It should have been a Jane. Just saying. But so you've got the family of four. They spent a lot of time together. Anybody that knew them said they were like the ideal family. But sadly, on June 19th, 1983, Sergeant John Heaton committed suicide. I don't know why. I couldn't find why he committed suicide. I don't know if he was suffering with some sort of depression or if something had happened at work that just pushed him over the edge. I'm not sure. It just says that he committed suicide. Jennifer was 4 and Melissa was 2. So they were very young. In 1985, Joan decides she wants to start over. She wants to start fresh. It's been a couple years since her husband committed suicide. It's time to start over. So she packs up her daughters and she moves to a neighborhood in Warwick, Rhode Island.
How long after his death?
It was about 2-ish years.
Okay.
Because he died in 1983 and then they moved in 1985. So depending on when they actually moved, when their move date was, it was right around 2 years. But now we're going to rewind back to the beginning. On October 11th, 1974, Craig Chandler Price was born to John and Shirley Price. They lived in Warwick, Rhode Island. Craig was one of 3 children. His parents were both employed. His dad, John, was a manager at a local Kmart, and his mom, Shirley, was a clerical worker also at that same Kmart. Any reports that I read said that Craig's childhood was next to perfect. His parents had a healthy relationship. They loved all 3 of their kids. But what we need to take slight note on is this case does involve, also, I guess, trigger point, does involve some racism. So this being in the early 70s, Craig's parents were very hardworking African Americans, and they lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. When I say predominantly white, I mean less than 1% of the total population was African American. So they were very hardworking and lived in a very nice neighborhood and surrounded themselves with people that I guess generally at that time felt they were better than them. With the racial tensions fresh from the civil rights movement and the fact that both of his parents were working to provide a better life for their 3 kids, you know, it just kind of tells you what kind of people his parents were. Does that make sense? Because I feel like in a lot of these cases, you always kind of question the kid's upbringing. But Craig was described as a happy, friendly child. If one of the neighbors or someone needed help, Craig was one of the first people to offer. He would help carry in groceries for his neighbors. He would offer to mow the grass, whatever it was. Like, he was known to be the class clown, the goofball in school, but he was still respectful. Like, he was silly, but knew to be respectful. He had good grades. He was a good kid. Like, all these different reports that I read said that he is a good kid. And then as soon as it gets into his criminal history, it's around 9 years old. So 4th grade-ish, he starts having dark thoughts about people dying. And some people speculate that this would cause Craig to become violent, like later on, all the dark thoughts he was having. By the time Craig turned 13, he was developing a knack for mischief. That's just to put it nicely, that is. His criminal record by 13 included stalking, drug use, assault, breaking and entering, and robbery.
At 9? Oh, 13.
By 13, he had all of those charges on his record. So between 9 and 13, he just kind of let loose.
That's crazy.
Other than the stalking, there weren't a lot of red flags for like the naughty preteen to escalate to murder, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, does it say when he starts like the drug use?
Yeah, we'll get to that. He joins a gang at 13. You're jumping ahead. So more or less, Craig's criminal record shows that he's troubled. Maybe due to the dark thoughts he's experiencing, who knows? But even with all his acting out, people within his circle, like teachers and people that he was close to, still described him as a happy, cheerful child, which to me doesn't make sense. Like, if you've got a happy kid, but they're breaking the law constantly, there's something lacking. So, I don't know. It's frustrating to see those red flags and nobody did anything. But Craig wanted to better himself. He would tell people he wanted to do better, and people remember him saying he was going to do better. But by 13, Craig ended up joining a local gang. Once he was in the local gang, he began experimenting with drugs. Originally, it just started off with smoking weed, and then eventually he tried LSD. And for those that don't know, LSD is a narcotic that it's also called acid. It's a psychedelic drug, and it's typically causes thoughts to be intensified, as well as emotions and sensory perception to be intensified. I've never done LSD, so I have no idea.
Same.
In high doses, LSD can cause visual and auditory hallucinations also. My search history is going to look absolutely crazy. If you combine LSD with marijuana, it's supposedly way more intense, and the weed intensifies the effects of the LSD. So I don't know how accurate that is. That's just what Google says. So people began noticing that Craig was a big boy. We're talking at 13 years old, he's 5'10" and 240 pounds. Like, he's a big boy.
How
He's a
big were
freaking,
his parents?
no idea. This kid's like a freaking linebacker.
They
Like,
feed him.
yeah. Well, he's now 6'4". He went from like he's a big guy. So here's Craig, 13, in a gang, developing quite the criminal record, experimenting with drugs. He starts stalking his neighbors, and that leads us to his first official murder, which he starts stalking 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer. Rebecca rented a home with Carl, her brother, and her 2 children. She was recently divorced. They lived right down the street from where Craig's parents lived. So the street they lived on, I did not write it down, but I believe Craig's address was like house number 67 and Rebecca's was number 70. So like they were right there. Rebecca's son was 8 and her daughter was 4. And the lease that Rebecca shared with her brother Carl was up at the end of July 1987. She was packing the house, but she had no luck because she was taking care of her 2 young kids. So she calls up her ex-husband and asks him to come pick up the kids so she could get some real packing done. On the morning of July 27th, 1987, it would be the last time Rebecca's kids would see their mother alive. Her ex comes over and picks up their kids. Rebecca invites a friend over, and her and her friend spent the morning packing boxes. The 2 women worked all day. Around 6 p.m., Rebecca made dinner for herself, her friend, and her brother. But her brother worked nights, so he left around 8:30 to go to work. Soon after Carl left to go to work, Rebecca's friend's boyfriend comes over to help pack. Great friends, by the way. Like, to kind of spend your whole day packing somebody else's crap. Like those are some A right there. Like that does not sound like a fun day. Hopefully they were.
I don't know if I'd want other people packing my stuff.
That too. Like
Not that I
don't
have
know.
anything to hide.
No, but it's like you just want, like, I like knowing where my stuff is. And I feel like if somebody else puts stuff in boxes, I'm not going to know. Does that make sense? Like, you just want
Yes.
to know where it is. But whatever.
So the one time we had a mover, like a hired mover person, people, they packed the kitchen trash, like the can with the trash in it. Fortunately, it was nothing disgusting or smelly. But 2 weeks later, when it arrived to where we were getting it moved to, that's disgusting. Like, if you can't tell, now mind you, I understand when you can't tell somebody's shit from what should be trash, but it was in the can.
Oh gosh. You think that would have warranted it? Ma'am, do you want to change the trash before
We pack it? Yes.
we box this bad boy up and stick it in the
I'm just gonna say there's eggshells in here.
Well, when the three friends were finished packing, they left to go get ice cream. So around 11 o'clock, they get back home to Rebecca's house and they decide to hang out for a bit. And then her friends leave. Her friend and the friend's boyfriend leave around midnight. After they left, Rebecca puts on her pajamas, grabs a blanket, and lays on the living room floor to watch TV. But exhausted from packing all day, she passes out pretty quickly. Now, at some point, 13-year-old Craig Price sneaks across his neighbor's yard and quietly broke into Rebecca's home. He said he stood over her, watching Rebecca curled up in the blanket. She was sound asleep and didn't even know he was there. So Craig walks away. He goes back to the kitchen to steal stuff, but then he decides he wants to kill Rebecca. He thought about grabbing a frying pan, and he grabs a frying pan, but as soon as he goes to leave the kitchen, he walked past a 10-inch kitchen knife that was on the counter, so he grabs it. He takes the knife and returns to Rebecca's sleeping body in the living room and proceeds to stab Rebecca. He stabbed her with such hatred and aggression, he punctured her heart, her lungs, her face, her liver, and her head 58 times. He stabbed her 58 times.
Now, since they were neighbors, did they actually know each other or just happened to be neighbors?
They just happened to be neighbors. So I feel like there was from what I gather, I feel like because all his neighbors were white for the most part, it was one of those, they kind of still kept their distance. Does that make sense? It's terrible. And I feel sorry for him because he shouldn't feel like an outcast. But
well, drugs won't help him fit in.
No, they won't. But 13-year-old Craig Price just brutally murdered his first victim. Once he was finished, he calmly stood up.
Whoa. You said hold up. He was how old?
13.
That's what I thought you said.
Yep. He was 13 years old. And he just stabbed a 27-year-old mother 58 times. Like that's horrendous.
Yeah.
Once he was finished, though, he calmly stood up, walked out the back door, climbed over Rebecca's fence, across her neighbor's yard, and back into his own home. On the morning of July 28th, 1987, Rebecca's brother Carl returned home from work and found his sister lying in a pool of her own blood, and he called 911. Now, this is really sad, okay? And this one got me all choked up. But even though she was dead, he proceeds to try to give her CPR until police arrive. Like, that's so heartbreaking.
Yeah. That's one of those you don't know what else to do but waiting for an ambulance and the police to show up. Yeah. That had to feel like a lifetime.
Yeah, and just staring at his sister who was stabbed in the heart, lungs, face, liver, and head. Like, that is just absolutely insane to walk in on.
Yeah.
Police have zero clues as to who would commit the crime. because she's a mother of two. They didn't live they lived there for a short period of time and their lease was up and they were moving out. The case grows cold almost immediately because they just have no idea. And then after Rebecca's murder, Craig kind of goes 2 years before his urges would start to fight their way to the surface. And during this time that he was kind of dormant, Craig was a freshman in high school at this point. He was doing great with his schoolwork. And that brings us to the beginning of our story. On September 1st, 1989, 15-year-old Craig, who just smoked some LSD-laced weed, is standing out front of Joan Heaton's home.
Okay, got a question.
Yeah.
So the first one, he was not on drugs. He just went on a stabbing spree.
We'll get to the confession.
Okay.
Craig murdered Rebecca in July 27th, 1987. Okay. And now it's September 1st, 1989. So it's about two and some change years later. Joan and her daughters had just moved to his neighborhood in 1985. So around the time Rebecca was murdered, about 2 years before he murdered Rebecca. So.
Ooh, was it in the same house?
No, I thought the same thing, but it wasn't. I had to look that one up too. It was not. Because that's what made me go back and look, because I was curious. I was like, holy shit, is this the same house? But then I went back, and so Joan moved to the same neighborhood as Craig in 1985, and Rebecca was murdered in 1987. So Joan and her daughters were already living in the neighborhood 2 years prior to Rebecca being murdered. Does that make sense?
Okay, but we're still in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, same neighborhood. And now that brings us back to our high 15-year-old Craig standing outside of Joan's home on September 1st, 1989. He decides to break into Joan's home because he can no longer resist the violent urges. Once inside the Heaton home, he went straight to the kitchen and he found a set of knives, which, by the way, Joan had just purchased earlier that day.
Oh.
Yeah. At some point, Craig must have made some kind of noise because Joan woke up. She went downstairs to see what the noise was and sees the very large 15-year-old standing with 6 knives in her kitchen. And he grabs 6 knives and she starts screaming. And he was scared that a neighbor would hear. And he ran at Joan and flung his massive body at her and started strangling her until she fell to the floor and had passed out. I watched some of the confession videos of him, and she bit him.
Good.
Like during all of this, but he strangled her till she passed out. He wasn't sure if she was dead or just passed out, so he started stabbing her. He stabbed her just like with Rebecca. He stabbed Rebecca 58 times, and now he just stabbed Joan 57 times. So that's a lot of aggression.
Yeah.
Craig's fear of someone hearing Joan screaming, proved both accurate and unfortunate because her screams woke up her 2 young daughters, Jennifer, who's now 10 years old, and Melissa, who's 8. Same ages as my girls. Craig spots Jennifer first as she came down the stairs to check on their mom, and he grabs her and begins stabbing her. Jennifer cried out for Melissa to please call 911. Craig stabbed Jennifer 62 times before he noticed that the terrified 8-year-old, Melissa, was almost to the kitchen where the phone was located. And it didn't take much for this humongous 15-year-old to overpower the little petite Melissa. He proceeds to stab the 8-year-old 37 times before he crushed her skull in with a stool.
What the fuck?
Yeah, like so brutal. He was so aggressive and violent while stabbing Melissa. The tip of one of the 6 knives he used while murdering this mother and her 2 daughters, the tip of one of the knives broke off in Melissa's neck.
Ugh.
Once he was finished with his brutal attack, he covered 2 of the bodies, one with a rug and one with a sheet, before he calmly left the Heaton home. just as he did after his vicious attack on Rebecca. He crept through the neighbors' yards and back to his own home.
Now, I find it hard to believe, even with the first murder, and especially the second one, where are his bloody clothes? Like,
We'll
how
get to
does
that.
he sneak back in his house? Like, I feel like there has to be some sort of cleanup on the way. Otherwise, him just showing up, he's going to leave blood smears somewhere.
I'm thinking he probably used the kitchen sink to wash his hands up, but as for the clothes, we'll get to that.
Okay.
So after she moved to a new city, Joan made sure she called her parents and sister a few times a week. Pretty much like with you. If you don't hear from me, you know something's wrong. I've talked
Sporadically throughout the day, though.
it's sporadically throughout the day, every single day, or hours on the phone every single day. So if you ever can't get a hold of me,
There's
it's
a
bad.
problem.
Yeah. So Joan's family hadn't heard from her for a few days prior to her being murdered. So when September 4th rolled around, they started to freak out. So Joan's mother, Marie, and her sister, Mary Lou, drive over to Joan's home to check on Joan and the girls. When Marie and Mary Lou pull up, they notice right away that Joan's car is parked in the driveway still. The mother-daughter duo knock on the door, but there's no answer. So they grow a little more concerned that she looks like she's home, but nobody's coming to the door. So they walk around the backyard and they find the back door is unlocked. As soon as they walk in the house, they saw blood everywhere. Unsure, or maybe they were in shock, they decide to continue to walk through the house, determined to find Joan and the girls. And in the hallway, they find Joan's body covered with a sheet. They find Jennifer's petite 10-year-old body wasn't too far from her mother's. And then the 8-year-old Melissa's battered, bloody body was found alone in the kitchen. Horrified to find the bodies of her daughter and her granddaughter in pools of their own blood, Marie and Mary Lou dial 911, and then they step outside of the house. So after Rebecca's attack, authorities believed that she had known her attacker because there was no sign of forced entry. There was no struggle. She'd only been in the area for a short time. It seemed to be an isolated attack because 2 years went by and nothing happened. And prior to that attack, there was nothing like it. So they kind of just chalked up Rebecca's murder as a one and done kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
However, once Joan and her daughters were viciously murdered, authorities now believe they had a serial killer because the similarities in the cases. Rebecca and Joan were both single moms with 2 kids. Rebecca and Joan, roughly, it's the same number of stab wounds because Rebecca was 58 and Joan was 57. They had nearly an identical stab pattern. The weapon of choice for both victims seemed they came from the victim's own home. However, interesting, the detectives never recovered any of the knives or weapons used in the murder of Rebecca, Joan, Jennifer, or Melissa. He used 6 knives on Joan and her daughters and took all 6 knives with him.
What the hell?
Yeah.
I don't even know how you carry 6 knives with you.
I don't either. Maybe he just took a bag. I have no idea. They also couldn't figure out a motive. So local detectives knew they needed some help and they reached out to Dr. Henry Lee. Dr. Lee was a world-renowned forensic specialist who specialized in blood analysis. Dr. Lee found a men's size 13 socked footprint in the blood at the crime scene. So if it's a sock footprint, you know how that is. You walk outside, your socks get wet, you walk inside, you can tell that it's textured, but you can see the size of the foot. Since there was no one barefoot for the police and no one in the home that wore a men's size 13, authorities knew it was most likely from their killer. Which, by the way, he took his shoes off.
That's what I was going to ask. Either that or he walked from his house there barefoot. He either took his shoes off. Well, I imagine, he probably did do that because if he wore them, it probably would be a dirty sock print.
Yeah. And then it would leave bloody footprints out the door. So he must have taken his shoes off.
Ew, which that means he put his bloody sock in his shoe.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. Another specialist that local detectives sought assistance from was FBI agent Greg McCrary. Agent McCrary wrote a book, Profiling the Predators Among Us. So if his book title isn't enough of a giveaway, Agent McCrary was a profiler for the FBI. Agent McCrary determined that there was a very frantic nature to the attacks. He told local police their suspect showed sheer anger and rage during the murders. And I don't say this to be rude, but that's kind of like, duh.
Yeah.
58 stab wounds, like that's intense. But due to the frantic nature of the murders, the killer probably cut himself. That's what McCurry said. And most likely with the same knife that broke off in the 8-year-old Melissa's neck. And then they said that basically they're looking for someone, a man, with a bandage on his arm or hand. So that was what the FBI profiler was able to put together. While officers were out doing their regular patrolling in the area, they find 15-year-old Craig Price with his friends at a local park. So the officers didn't suspect him of the crime. However, due to Craig's many previous run-ins with breaking the law, the officers were familiar with him, and they knew Craig was familiar with the street. And Craig also participated in many local police-sponsored youth events. So I just find that crazy. Like, if you're going to break the law but also participate in the events, it's like he really wanted to be a good kid, but he just couldn't stick with being a good kid. So these two officers approach Craig mainly because they're curious if there's any word on the street about who the serial killer could be.
Mm-hmm.
And as they approach Craig, they notice that his hand was wrapped in a bandage. So they question Craig about his injuries, and he tells the officers that he was drunk one night and decided to punch out a car window down the street. So, yeah. So he admits to vandalism,
Underage drinking.
And underage drinking. Well, but both of which are better than murder.
Valid.
So temporarily satisfied, the officers go back to the station. One of the officers decides to look into Craig's story about the vandalizing of the vehicle. So they looked up the reports. They couldn't find anything. They also looked along the street that he claimed he vandalized the vehicle on for any type of shattered glass or anything. They found nothing. Well, they found nothing to confirm Craig's story. So still questioning Craig's story, they pull up his record, and officers see most of Craig's crimes were breaking and entering and stalking. Some of the major red flags that were going up for these officers, like there were some, but they didn't do anything right away because they knew whoever killed Joan, Jennifer, and Melissa also killed Rebecca, and Craig would have only been 13. And it seemed too far-fetched that a 13-year-old could commit such a violent murder and not leave evidence.
Yeah, I would think, but then it's just like he's humongous, so
yeah,
that.
But at that time, they didn't think it was possible for a 13-year-old to be so vicious. But officers receive a call, and they end up receiving a call from one of Craig's friends saying that Craig was bragging about how he killed Rebecca and got away with it. This call from Craig's friend, plus the officer's suspicions, they go ahead and they get a search warrant. And on September 17th, 1989, the Warwick, Rhode Island police officers raid the Price family home. When Craig woke up to find the officers searching his parents' home, he rolled over and went back to bed. Like, he just didn't give a shit. As officers believed that they'd be leaving with nothing, one of the officers looked out back and saw a shed. So they all go out there, and in the shed, the officers find a plastic bag hidden behind other stuff. When they open the mysterious bag, they find everything. Tons of blood-soaked clothes, gloves, knives. Their smoking gun was a bloodied sock that matched the crime scene at the Heaton home. Craig was immediately arrested. His hardworking mother agrees to ride with her son and the officers. Officers reported that she cried the entire ride. Meanwhile, Craig was calm, cool, and collected. He acted like he had no care in the world and they were just out to joyride. I feel so bad for his mother. During Craig's interrogation, detectives asked why he always seemed so angry all the time. Craig implied he was angry due to racism. Allegedly, the racism Craig experienced is what fueled his inner monster. And Craig recounted playing with a group of friends when a white man called them the N-word and cussed at them to get out of the road. Craig said that this interaction angered him. He was angry with this ignorant man, but also with himself for not standing up for himself and his friends against this man. So a little bit of self-hatred there. Craig decided he was going to get his revenge on this rude, racist white man. Craig admitted to watching the man for several days. He paid close attention to the driveway he would return to every single morning. It was Carl, Rebecca's brother. Police questioned Carl about the encounter, and Carl adamantly denied Craig's version of the events that day. He said he never yelled a slur or cussed at the kids or cussed at anyone else.
I think they could have asked him, has he ever used that slur ever? Because this is several years later, so he probably wouldn't remember.
Yeah. Craig's confession about his rage towards Carl, he tells detectives details about Rebecca's brutal murder. So Craig waited for his family to fall asleep, and he snuck out. He crept through the neighbor's yard and over Rebecca's fence. He claimed he was upset to see Carl's car was gone, so he must not have watched him too well to not realize that his car was gone every night. So he went home and he smoked weed that was laced with LSD. So to answer your question, he was high. Once he was high, Craig decided to return to the home of Carl and Rebecca to see if the car was back. And if not, he was going to steal stuff from the guy. If he couldn't go confront this man, I think to murder him, he was just going to steal his stuff. But when Craig peeked inside, he said he saw the TV on and a woman lying on the floor curled up with a blanket. He said he decided...
She was on the floor?
Well, because they packed everything up. I'm guessing there was like a U-Haul situation. Craig said that in that moment, he decided he'd break in and murder the woman in her sleep. Detectives knew that he wasn't one of those people giving like a false confession because he was able to describe the boxes in the corner of the room and other details that you would have had to be there to know what happened. After confessing to Rebecca's murder, he began telling investigators about slaughtering Joan and her young daughters. He explained how he strangled Joan until she collapsed and how he stabbed her until he spotted Jennifer and Melissa. Then this monster of a 15-year-old mocked the young girls' cries and said how they pled for him to stop even while he was stabbing them. Like he was mocking their cries. Like it's so disgusting. The investigators sat stunned as they listened to the 15-year-old boy recount the horrific details of all four of these vicious attacks. When he was finally finished, detectives charged Craig Chandler Price with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of burglary. In 1989, it was against the American criminal justice system to imprison a juvenile past their 21st birthday, and Craig was just shy of his 16th birthday. Meaning, once he was found guilty of the murder charges, he would be set free after 5 to 6 years. Yeah. If he was 18 at the time of the murders, he would get a mandatory life sentence. But because he was under 18 and he was a juvenile, he would get out after he turned 21.
Please tell me he died in jail.
Oh, and after the 5 or 6 years, and he would be set free, his records would be sealed. So he would be given a fresh start. However, on September 21st, 1989, he was supposed to go through psychological examinations and then therapy for whatever they determined he needed so they could properly rehabilitate him to come back into society. But Craig refused to cooperate with all health and state officials trying to rehabilitate him. And since it was court mandated, he was going to get in trouble for that. And then you also have the public, which was furious with Craig's leniency. And people started realizing that teenagers potentially were just as big of monsters as adults, but they were just given way more lenient sentences. And so that brings us to Jeffrey Pine. He was the assistant attorney general, and Kevin Collins, who was the Warwick police detective. They decide to join up together, and they help get the O'Neill bill passed. The O'Neill bill is what makes sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders more strict. I had trouble finding certain details on things, but I'm guessing it would make it to where they could hold him longer or try someone as an adult, but it doesn't really matter because Craig's already been tried and convicted, and he's only going to serve until his 21st birthday. So even though they got this bill passed, it was not going to be enough to keep Craig in jail. So Jeffrey Pine, the assistant attorney general, wanted to further his knowledge to understand violent criminal minds like Craig in an attempt to better protect the citizens of Rhode Island. So Jeffrey Pine packs up and he attends a training program taught by the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. And during the training, Jeffrey Pines learns that less than 1% of murderers are as frenzied during the killings as Craig Price was. He also learned that there's no realistic way to rehabilitate these types of attackers to ensure that they don't become repeat offenders. So he just learned that Craig is one of less than 1%. So good luck. Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Pine took all this newfound knowledge back to Rhode Island courts. He asked the courts to order Craig to do psychological testing and any therapy needed. Again, like they tried to do it again. That way they could try to help this kid. And they're trying to make it so that when he gets released, he can be productive with society, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But Craig, being the stubborn teenager that he is, he still flat out refuses to cooperate. Jeffrey Pine files a contempt of court charges against Craig in 1994. Now, if you do the math based off of his birthday of 1973 and 1994, he was about to get out when this assistant attorney general filed these contempt charges. And Craig was pissed. Like, he was angry. He was livid, and he probably because he was getting ready to get released, and now they're trying to find a way to keep his ass in there. And while in court, Craig threatened to kill an officer. That doesn't seem like a smart move.
Mm-mm.
And since he was already a convicted serial killer, they found him guilty for contempt of court and for threatening to kill again. That seals his fate. He was sentenced to 15 more years with 8 years suspended, so 7 more years. So he was about to get out, and now he just got 7 years. Since Craig's outburst in court in 1994, his violent outbursts have only gotten worse. In 1996, he got an additional year for biting the finger of an officer. In 1997, again with contempt of court for still refusing the psychological testing, he receives 25 more years for still being in contempt of court, but with 15 years suspended. So he got an additional 10 years. Then in 1999 and 2001, Craig verbally and physically assaults another officer, and he got 4 more years added onto his sentence. After yet another fight in prison, he was transferred again. In 2004, Craig was moved to Florida because of his violent tendencies. And then in March 2009, he was denied parole. Thank God. Also, in July 29th, 2009, I'm guessing he was angry about being denied parole. And Craig was in yet another prison fight. And an officer trying to break up the fight was stabbed in the hand with a shiv, which, if you don't know what a shiv or a shank is, it's a
Get out from under the rock that you live under.
Yeah, it's a sharpened tool made generally in jail to use as a weapon.
That may or may not be kept in a jail wallet.
If you want to explain a jail wallet, go for it.
It's your butthole.
Anyway,
Prisoners smuggle things. So I don't know from personal experience.
that was my next question. But Craig was due for parole in February 2022. Yeah, hang on, we get there. Craig being the self-destructive individual that he was.
Yay.
So when right? So in 2009, when he ended up stabbing that officer during a prison fight, he was still due for parole in February of 2022. But then in 2017, he made yet another shiv or shank, whatever you want to call it. On January 18th, 2017, he attacked another prisoner, Joshua Davis. And then on January 18th, 2019, he got another 25 years added to his sentence for that attack on Joshua Davis. And just so you know, you don't have to feel sorry for Joshua Davis, okay? Davis was a 6 foot tall man, so it's a pretty even. Craig's 6'4", this guy's 6 foot. And Davis is in jail for life for second-degree murder. So he's not a
innocent party.
Yeah, he's still in jail, thankfully. He's got a little while longer. And since he hasn't been cooperating with his psychological testings and therapies, I'm guessing they'll just keep going after him for contempt of court. So hopefully he will never see the light of day. But that's all I got. And that's what the train's got.
That was like a funny interjection. That's all you got again. So there.
But this Craig Price one, it really gets me because he started off at 9 years old. That's so young.
Not to say racism's not bad, but what he did, not cool. So I don't understand if you want to come at it on that side of people were mean to me or they had things or made me feel less than. Those particular people didn't.
Yeah. To get back at somebody that was mean to him, he viciously murders his
sister.
Female. He didn't know it was his sister, but just the female that lives in the house. How does 1 + 1 = 58? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
That one I'd have to hawk it up to, get some mental issues, some wires crossed somewhere, because I think the ability to reason not there. And not to say that's how he was raised or not raised, but that seems more like it was a bad egg to start with.
But he was happy about it, so.
Yeah.
And you can go online and you can actually watch some of his interactions in his videos. And also, if you open up the email, the one that's titled Craig Price, there's pictures of him in there, and
that we will post.
Yes, we will. He's a big boy. He drank some good water there because he had one hell of a growth spurt.
I feel like it was the milk.
I feel like it was the LSD.
I don't feel like that grows you. I feel like that makes you turn into the juggernaut of you just mash through things without a thought or a care.
Which is literally what he did.
That's why they said it. Well, I mean, I've heard where people are hopped up on LSD and just charge a police officer and they're not fazed by tasers or shit like that. So it's you can't stop them. Although I could be wrong, but I feel like it might have been the Vikings that wasn't it LSD they'd get all hopped up on.
I'm not sure.
And that's why and then they would be these vicious warriors. They'd actually, oh man, I'm going to have to look this one up. We might have to crop it out. But they would battle naked when they were all hyped up, and they would strike some serious fear into who they were charging after. And many a times people would run away. It was just the fuck. But when we were watching, I think it was on the Discovery Channel. But they would be
if I saw somebody screaming naked running at me,
with a weapon,
I'm gonna turn tail and run too.
So you can have my tent. I'm gonna run up this field. But they would also like foam at the mouth. So it's like, yep, no, I'm leaving.
Hard pass.
Yes, like
Not the way to go.
clearly.
So I feel like tomorrow
We
we
probably
should.
shouldn't do children. Give that one a
So-
rest. Shall we? Why can't I find adult on adult crime? Is that so hard? Like,
I don't know, but I don't know why I keep finding. Okay, granted, I know I have children of all ages, but why do I
they're
keep?
your age?
Yes, like 8 and 10. My daughters are literally 8 and 10. Like,
Hey.
come the fuck on, man.
I'm just asking for a couple adults killing adults. Is that so hard to ask? Every single one has had children dying.
So I have one case, and it was the first one I ever did that Jason said was boring.
The
And the
base
only,
team?
huh? No, this one's the Mannings. And the only reason I haven't done it is because I can't pronounce half the shit in it.
Yeah, well, that's why I called Carl. One, because that's his fucking name, but his last name, I don't know how to say it. Panzam? That doesn't sound right.
Yeah, that's weird.
Pazam! That sounds too cool. So he's Carl. Although, have you noticed that? No, I think it's a way specifically to write it to make it more humanizing for the victim. But usually, when I'm reading these articles, they'll reference the killer by last name and the victims by first name.
Yes, I have noticed that.
And I think
Which is
that is
crazy
like,
'cause
I think it's
isn't-
a way to make it like if it's not just another last name person. That way you sympathize for the victim as if you wouldn't. But
But the thing is isn't calling somebody by their last name like dignified? They fucking do it in the military.
no. So the reason they do that in the military, same way, is that they don't want you to be on a first name basis with them because casualties of war, you got to be able to keep going. So that's why they don't use first names.
Harsh.
It is, but I mean, that's why they only last name you in the military.
It's fucked up.
It's more fucked up would be if you were a number, but there's too many of them to remember a number, so they're last namers. Which is why I feel like it's the same way when it's the articles, because they last name them at I don't want to say a disrespect, but they want you to be on a more of an emotional level, knowing people by their first names when it's the victims. I just thought it was interesting. Because when I was taking my notes, sometimes when I do that, it gets me messed up because everything I'm researching, they're using their last name, not Carl. So it messes with my notes when it's like, then they start talking about the victims.
I just sent you pictures of Craig.
He's a fat little kid. I mean, he's not little because he's bigger than that grown man. Thank you for listening to Homicide Hobbies. I'm Claire.
I'm Andy.
Follow us each week to get your fix of the atrocities that occur in true crime. And don't forget to tell people about us and rate us if you like us. But don't rate us if you didn't. Just change the channel.